Hello, Jan. How are
Hello.
you doing today?
All right. I'm all right. Holding up, doing
Yeah,
some work. Can't complain.
yeah.
How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. It's classes are starting soon, so looking forward to it.
All right. Cool.
So tell us how you got interested or introduced to philosophy.
Um. Well, I don't recall the exact moment anymore. But I know that there were also always like some general history of philosophy books laying around at the house when I was younger. And I noted at certain moments I was just going through them, thinking, okay, this seems like a bit out there sometimes. I didn't always understand why people were asking these questions concerning, for example, the foundations of knowledge or the meaning of life, or for example.
Right.
But over time, I do think that I just, in a way, picked up on these questions and started thinking about them. And then in the last year of high school, we had uh, half a year of a course where the teacher actually gave us history of philosophy, and I remember that we were discussing Nietzsche, and that then at that moment I thought, okay, this seems really out there, this seems really strange, but at the same time I want to know why do all these people ask these kinds of questions, and I think that's where I'm more or less in discussion with the teacher, then made a sort of click and started thinking about, okay, maybe that's what I would like to study in more detail, philosophy. And then the thought continued playing in my head a bit, started reading a bit more, and then I thought, okay, I'll try it out and see what it gives. And then I started my philosophy studies, I think now 10 years ago or something. Yeah. So that's how I rolled into philosophy, I guess.
Okay. Wow. So you've been into philosophy for a very long time then, or at least you started
Uh,
early in high
so I
school.
started, yeah, I was 19 at the time. So more or less straight out of high school, I started my philosophy studies, and then I studied philosophy for 5 years. Did my PhD afterwards for 4 years, and then so now I've been doing postdoctoral research now for a year and a half, more or less. So yeah, I think more or less 10 to 11 years or something. Yeah.
Okay. And you study philosophy of science and history of physics. What
Yeah.
is your favorite part about studying these topics?
So what I really like is that the history of physics as a field um, has already a long history. So there's a lot of different materials, especially about the period I'm focusing on mostly, which is um, let's call it early 20th century physics. So the moment where you see Einstein's special theory of relativity or the new quantum emerging, for example. There's a lot of historical studies about this period. And at the same time, there's also a lot of philosophical reflection on it. And there is, of course, very much an overlap, but there's at the same time, there's also a lot of historical literature, historical material that I have the impression, at least, is very relevant for more general philosophy of science reflection. So you often see a lot of overlap between history of physics and philosophy of physics, but there seems to be a lot of interesting material in history of physics for more general philosophy of science as well. So I'm thinking what I'm very into at the moment, for example, is the work by Catherine Olesko or David Kaiser, who are all working on the history of physics education, on physics textbooks, on physics seminars, and when I read these materials, I have the impression, okay, there's a lot of historical material that could be of interest for people working on more philosophical notions such as perspectives or paradigms, or the notion of tacit knowledge and embodiment, and the material culture of experimentation, and so on. So that's what I really like about um, about this combination of doing history of physics, where there's already a lot of material, but at the same time, there's also a lot of things that still need to be investigated further. But at the same time, it allows me to always keep these more philosophical questions in mind a bit.
Why exactly did you choose physics education specifically? Is there something special about that compared to other philosophy of physics topics?
Um, I don't know. So I more or less rolled into history of physics while I was doing my master dissertation. My master dissertation was about thought experiments, and one of the thought experiments I discussed was one formulated by Albert Einstein in the introduction of his special relativity paper. And while I was working through the thought experiment and the literature already existing on it, I more or less rolled into history of physics in the history of this period as well. And over time, I've found that I kept coming back to this period and to the literature on it to in a sort of way elaborate my own philosophical takes on certain issues. And then yeah, after a while, I don't know. Maybe it was because I was already working on perspectives, on perspectivalism, and on the relation with Kuhnian paradigms. And you have, of course, Kuhn talking about textbook science and so on. And then I realized, well, there's a lot of history, a lot of historical literature on physics textbooks, on physics seminars. So I started looking into that, and then maybe I don't know, maybe that's the way in which I ended up looking at physics as education, or the history of physics education. But
Yeah,
I
that's
guess
great.
that would be a reasonable or a kind of trajectory that I could have followed.
Yeah, definitely. So in January of last year, you published a paper titled Perspectivism and the Epistemology of Experimentation, from the evaluation to the production of reliable experiments. So would you just briefly summarize the upshot of this paper for us?
Yeah. So the starting point is a discussion, a very specific discussion between Anyan Chakravarti and Michela Massimi about the way in which perspectivalism could accommodate or could make sense of um, um, or could be used, the notion of perspectives, how it could be used to study experimental knowledge. And so in my paper, I try to argue that both of them have a conception of perspectives in mind, where perspectives are to be seen as more or less a set of explicit theoretical commitments. And then in the paper, I argue that, yeah, of course, there are certain scientists, when they conduct or interpret or evaluate experiments, they of course have certain explicit commitments, and that's important to understand why they interpret the experiments as they do. But at the same time, there's also a lot of, let's call it, tacit aspects that are also at play in the interpretation or evaluation of these experiments. So in order to, for example, replicate experiments, you need to have certain skills, and that's not an explicit, you can't consider that to be an explicit commitment of any kind. That's more of a tacit kind of aspect of scientific practice. And the same goes for example, the materials that are often used in the replication of or in the construction of experimental setups. And in the paper, I argue that, look, I think it's important that if we want to talk about perspectives and the role they have in science, and more particularly in experimentation, then we also need to take into account these tacit aspects. And then I try to elaborate a more or less kind of like, yeah, starting point for how can we incorporate these tacit elements in the notion of perspectives. So that's the more or less the what I think to be the most important, or the central point, or the central approach I would like to take in that paper, and also in current work I'm carrying out.
Mm. What exactly, just for the listeners who might not know what this is, what exactly do you mean by the tacit aspects?
So the tacit is often contrasted with so you have, on the one hand, you have tacit elements, and on the other hand, you have explicit elements. So for example, when you have a set of raw data, raw experimental data, scientists will use a particular theory, for example, to interpret these data in order to see, okay, what can we infer from them? And that's an explicit commitment. So that's something they say, okay, I assume this theory, I explicitly assume this theory in order to interpret and evaluate these data. On the other hand, the tacit are certain things like skills, for example, that are also important for the functioning of the experiment and for the functioning of the interpretation or the evaluation that scientists carry out. But these are often things that cannot be translated or that cannot be explicated so easily. So it's difficult to just say, okay, we are going to study, as philosophers, we're going to study just the theoretical commitments, for example. And what I argue is, look, you need to take into account these things, these aspects that are important, but that cannot be equated with explicit commitments. You need to take these into account as well. So the tacit is more or less, yeah, it's the important but unexplicable, or at least implicit elements that also play a role in how scientists go about in their practice.
Okay, yeah, that really, I think, will clarify things. And then you also, part of your thesis states that if we reconceptualize perspectives in science in the way that you argue for, we can allow for realism. So what exactly, like, why would this happen? And then would you explain a little bit more the thought process?
So the main motivation for including the realism part in the paper was that the discussion between Chakravarti and Massimi, that was more or less the starting point of the paper, was really about whether or not perspectivism can also be a realism, a scientific or a form of scientific realism. So in general, scientific realism is a philosophical position with regards to with regards to how we are to see and interpret and consider scientific knowledge claims. So on the one, it's often contrasted with an empiricist reading of scientific knowledge claims, where at issue is the question, well, look, if we have a successful scientific theory, for example, then an empiricist will say, okay, that success entails that theory is true with regards to what is observable, with regards to the empirical. So the theory can postulate all kinds of unobservable entities, but we shouldn't take its success to mean that the theory is also true with regards to these unobservables. And then the realist, on the other hand, will argue, no, this success, predictive success, mostly, or explanatory success of a scientific theory, also gives us good reason to believe that the theory is also true with regards to the underlying or unobservable entities that the theory postulates. And so with regards to perspectivism, you have a kind of problem at first hand, because different scientists belonging to different perspectives can agree on the success of a certain experiment, for example, or a certain theory, a certain predictive success. They can agree on that. But at the same time, because they work within different perspectives, they can have really different interpretations of the unobservables underneath this success. And so if you claim, as most perspectivists do, that you can be a perspectivalist but also a realist, then you end up with a problem, because then if your success entails the truth of the perspective, then we end up with different incompatible, inconsistent true perspectives. I don't know if that's already a bit clearer, or...
Yeah, no, that's great. That was a great answer.
With regards to the second part of your question, so in the paper, I try to elaborate this kind of notion of cross-perspectival interpretation, where the idea is that if different perspectives agree on the success of a certain experiment, or on the predictive success of a certain theory, then that presupposes a sort of process of cross-perspectival interpretation, where a certain scientist working within a particular perspective, through that process, will try to make explicit the tacit elements of the other perspective, and vice versa. Agreement presupposes that there is a kind of interpretation of each other's perspective, and then I try to argue that this process of interpretation already brings about a certain agreement about the truth of certain claims about the unobservables as well. And thus, if you have agreement about the translation, then there's also a kind of like agreement about truth values, and in that way, you can elaborate, I guess, a sort of realism that is cross-perspectival. So you can have perspectivalism and at the same time also a sort of realism. But yeah, that was mostly, I tried to do that because that was the context in which the debate was taking place. So at the moment, I'm not working that much anymore on the realism question. I'm more focusing on, or trying to elaborate further, the ideas in the paper about experimentation and tacit aspects of perspectives and so on.
Okay. So what are you working on next, then?
So now I'm working on a paper that has been already quite long in the making. A first version of it I presented at the previous integrated HPS conference. So that's 2 or 3 years ago now. And since then I've been elaborating it further. And it's about a particular series of experiments on the electron between 1901 and 1911, more or less, in Germany. And for a while, these experiments were considered to be to be very important, because they were seen as allowing for a decision between the new theory of relativity on the one hand and certain electrodynamical theories already existing at the time. And a lot of people try to replicate and improve these experiments. But then after a certain while, it seems like people just started thinking, well, the approach we tried here just doesn't seem to make that much sense anymore. And so what I tried to elaborate in the paper is, okay, what were what was the context in which this experimental approach made a lot of sense? Why did people think it valuable and meaningful to engage in these kinds of electron experiments? And what changed over time, so that after a while people just thought, no, this doesn't seem to be like any meaningful way to engage, or we can't infer this much from the results we obtained in these kinds of experiments. So it's more of a historical paper, but at the same time, again, you see this idea, or I try to elaborate it in such a way that there is also attention for notions, more philosophical issues such as perspectives, tacit aspects, and so on.
So this connects really well to your previous paper that we just talked about, right?
Yeah. So it's more of a historical study in which I try to give flesh to or try to work out further the philosophical ideas I discussed in the more philosophical paper. Yeah.
Okay, so then do you have like a specific writing process that you use when you're writing, or do you kind of more free flow?
No, so I try to what I do nowadays is try to get away from the computer as much as possible. So since a few months, I started writing on paper again with a pen. So what I do is
Really?
I do have my computer open to consult articles and books and so on. But at the same time, I do all my writing on actual paper. Because I have the feeling that it gives me a bit more freedom in like um, writing down ideas and then seeing, okay, this doesn't work. This doesn't work as I want it to be, and then just instead of erasing it all and not having the wrong things or the problematic things there anymore, actually scratching them out, trying out new things, and it seems like that's a more constructive way for me to build a text. So that's what I've been trying out now for the last few months. Because during the first lockdown here in Belgium a few months ago, I worked mostly on computer, and that became very frustrating after a while because often I had been writing for a whole day, and then in the end of the day I would reread and I would erase a lot because I wasn't satisfied with it anymore. But then you end your day with almost nothing. Whereas now I end the day with a lot of papers all scratched out, but at least you have like a material output that you could say, okay, there's something in there. There's also a lot of problems there, but at least I have something to build on further the
It's
next
a
day.
lot more satisfying to
Yeah,
be able to have the history of your work, I
yeah,
bet.
and you also have the physical activity of writing with a pen, which I also enjoy very much. I don't know why, but yeah.
Yeah, no, that's pretty unique, definitely, especially because I think everyone lately has been on their computers all the time now, given the lockdowns. So, you have any advice for younger philosophers out there who are just starting in the field?
Um, so I remember when I started doing my research that I was often I wouldn't say frustrated, but that for quite a long period of time I had difficulties in expressing what my research was actually about. So there were a lot of very different. So I had a part of a different historical researches on different periods, different experiments. At the same time, I was reading different materials in philosophy of science, and I had so I was interested in all of them, and I tried to work on all of them. But at the same time, I didn't have any like um, kind of way to directly tie them together. And I realized, or I had the impression that I was sometimes frustrated by that. But in the end, I would like to say to people, don't be frustrated by that. Just do whatever interests you, and even if it doesn't tie together, just try to work it out further. And then, yeah, sometimes it clicks. Sometimes you're just working on different topics, but as long as you're interested in it, try to go for it, and don't because looking back on it, I think what frustrated me a bit was this idea that if you're working in philosophy, you have to have a more or less general theory of different things hanging together, and that was not the case with me. So for people who recognize the situation, I just say no, go for it, and try to work out your interests, even if there's no unification possible.
I think that's really great advice, especially for undergrads who just have all these ideas and struggle to really just put them down or are frustrated by the actual process. I think that's
Yeah.
extremely helpful advice.
Yeah, and
So,
as well, what I've also experienced and still am experiencing more and more, and especially now that I'm teaching a bit as well, is that if I read materials that at first don't seem to be connected that well to what I'm doing in my historical research, for example. So for the course I was teaching, I read quite a lot of philosophy of biology, for example, philosophy of psychology, history of psychology, for example. At first, there's no real direct connection, but I had the impression that by engaging with this seemingly distant literature, that it allowed me to build new bridges, and that's what I like very much as well. So if you have different interests, go for it. Go for all of them.
Definitely. All right, so last question. What is your favorite project that you have worked on as a philosopher? So this can be either like a paper you've written or something that you have, perhaps like a conference that you've spoken at, or something within philosophy that doesn't necessarily need to be one of those.
Yeah, so I would say that the paper I'm working on right now, because it has been a very long process, very frustrating at times, but in the end, it's going quite well at the moment, and I'm quite satisfied with the way in which I'm formulating it at the moment, and it's also I'm also quite I also very much like this project because it brought me into contact with a lot of people. So I started it out more or less when I did one semester as a visiting student in Cambridge 3 years ago now, and that's where I started more or less on the project. So I met a lot of very nice and interesting people there. Then, as I said, I presented it at the previous integrated HBS conference, which for me personally was one of the most fun conferences and interesting conferences I've ever been to. Because there I really had the impression, okay, this is a community where I would like to present my work, and there's a lot of room for discussion. And even though, because you're all working in a way that tries to integrate history with philosophy, you're often working on very different historical episodes, but at the same time, there does seem to be a way or something in between all those projects that makes it worthwhile to discuss and engage with each other's work. So that's where I met a lot of people with whom I discussed the paper. And again and again at workshops, in Louvain-la-Neuve, for example, last year I presented a version of it that was completely different than the one I presented at the Integrated HBS conference. And then the paper the manuscript I'm writing now is even completely different from the last presentation I gave about it. But over time, it has allowed me to engage with a lot of people on this specific historical episodes. And it has allowed me to elaborate a lot of ideas that are not even in the paper, but that I still think that I could make use of in later work. So in a sense, it also led me to the research or the paper I wrote for this conference, for example, on Kuhn, which is at first not really related to the paper, but then over time you start to see bridges or links as well. So I would definitely say, yeah, the work I'm carrying out right now, I really enjoy it. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm definitely excited for it to come out. I mean, it sounds like you've been working on it for a while and have gotten pretty extensive feedback and have been working on it for the last few years.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm actually quite curious what the response will be. We'll see.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So, okay, well, that's all the time we have, but thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
So, all right.
All right.
Bye.
Bye-bye.